Okay, guys, this is chapter 6, the self. During adolescence, because the brain is developed or is developing more, we have the ability to start with self-reflection or reflection about the self. Now, in individualistic cultures, they encourage reflection about the self, while the collectivist culture focuses on the needs of the group over the individual, so self reflection is not as important to them. It's not something that needs to happen, let's put it that way. Now, when we talk about the self in adolescence, it's the capacity for abstract thought. Means an adolescent can distinguish between the actual self, who they are, the possible selves, who they might become, the ideal self, who I would like to be, and the feared self, who I dread becoming. You know how you say, I'll never be like you, mom and dad? A lot of times we don't want to be that, but we end up saying those same things to our children once we grow up and have kids. Even though we dreaded hearing that from our parents. Like, once or while you live under my roof, you'll do what I say. Things like that. There's also something about the false self. The false self is one we put out to people, basically lying to people. So it's we put out this false self of who we are a lot of times because of either fear of who we are or not wanting to talk about who we are. Now, clarifying the difference here, one of the things we need to discuss is the self-esteem. Self-esteem refers to a person's overall sense of worth or well-being. The self-concept, on the other hand, refers to the way a person views and evaluates herself or himself. These terms also could be self-image or self-perception. It's interesting. Self-esteem from pre-adolescence through adolescence will decline in early adolescence and then rise through late adolescence and emerging adulthood. Now, the value of high self-esteem varies among cultures and ethnic groups. So, for instance, African American adolescents have higher self-esteem than adolescents in other ethnic groups. Now, when we talk about self-esteem, one of the things we'll look at is baseline self-esteem. This is stable, enduring sense of worth and well-being, while you also have what's called the barometric self-esteem. It's a fluctuating sense of worth and well-being as one responds to different thoughts, experiences through the course of the day. Your self-esteem may increase because you're in school and you score well on a test. It may decrease because, hey, you got into a fight or you got in trouble by the teacher, so it may decrease. Now, those scales are basically considered or are done by Rosenberg, that baseline and barometric self-esteem. Harder came out with the 8 domains of adolescent self-image. So when we look at it, our self-esteem is based on different things. And one of the things is, or I should say one, but many different things can play a part in where our self-esteem is coming from. So for instance, you have scholastic competence, social acceptance, athletic competence, physical appearance, job competence, romantic appeal, behavioral conduct, and close relationships. This is Harder's 8 domains of adolescent self-image. Do not forget that. Now, self-esteem and physical appearance, for instance, is most strongly related to global self-esteem. It's followed by social acceptance from peers. Peers are very important in adolescence. Never forget that. So, for instance, when I said to you in another lecture, parents, you're not as important in adolescence as their peers are, has a lot to do with not only higher self-esteem, things like that, but also developing their own identity or autonomy. Now, self-esteem in emerging adulthood tends to rise. The focus is on physical appearance, that lessens, I should say, improved relations with parents, increased feelings of acceptance. There's also more control over the social context of everyday life. Now you can make your own decisions to do what you want. Mom and dad aren't controlling what you can do in life. Now, causes and effects of self-esteem, feeling accepted and approved by others, for instance, or relationships with parents, approval from adults, outside the family. And of course, always school success. School success does play a part in self-esteem and emerging adulthood. Now, there is a interesting study in your text, the beeper study, in which adolescents are beeped at random times during the day and asked to record their emotional states. Adolescents record feeling self-conscious and embarrassed 2 to 3 times more than adults. Adolescents are moodier than pre-adolescents. Adolescents experience more negative moods than the pre-adolescents. Older adolescents were less volatile, fewer extremes, for instance, in emotions than the younger adolescents. As we know, we get more control over our emotions as adolescents get older. Now, Erickson talks about, or I should say, drew on his experience as a teacher, a psychoanalyst, an ethnographer, and a therapist. He developed a comprehensive theory of human development across the lifespan. Ding, ding, ding. Primary focus was adolescence, the time of greatest influence on identity development. So, Erickson believed that each life period is characterized by a particular developmental issue or crisis. For each issue or crisis, there is a developmentally healthy path and an unhealthy path. For instance, crisis in infancy was trust versus mistrust. So the healthy path is establishing secure trust with care providers, and the unhealthy path or mistrust results from the failure to establish a secure sense of trust. We attach at birth, or most people do. A lot of why they put the baby on mom's chest after the birth and after they're cleaned up is because there's a bonding that happens or an attachment that happens. I mean, think about it. For 9 months, what were they hearing in stereo? Mom's heartbeat. So also being able to feed the child, things like that. It's kind of unfair for the father, but hey, mom bonds first. That's reality. Moms are seen as the nurturers. So it's key for the baby to attach to the mother. You also see the same thing in other species. More or less, it's not called attachment. It's called, now I lost my train of thought. I'll get back to that because now I can't remember off the top of my head. But it is a form of bonding. Imprinting, thank you. There we go, I got it. So they imprint, and that's why a lot of times you might see these weird videos where a bird is attached to or bonded with a squirrel or a cat or something like that. First thing they see, they basically imprint as mommy. So there's actually a book from Dr. Seuss called Are You My Mommy? Or Are You My Mom? And it goes through a whole story of this bird trying to figure out who his mom is, or she's trying to find out who her mom is. And they're trying to imprint, basically, is what's going on there. Now, gender and emotional self. Do adolescents, girls, lose their voice? Well, Carol Gilligan, we brought up before. Carol Gilligan believed that boys learn to assert their opinions, whereas girls lose their voice and become insecure, or can become insecure. Critics argue that Carol Gilligan's findings on the differences between girls and boys are exaggerated, so they're not as big as she made them out to be. Now, more identity exploration, going back to that. The psychosocial moratorium. This is a period when adult responsibilities are postponed as young people try on various possible selves. Identity formation is founded partly on identification made in childhood. So, for example, children identify with their parents. Adolescents reflect on identifications and decide which they want to embrace. Identity confusion may be the result of an inability to handle all the choices that are available and an inability to decide amongst them. So you do see that a lot. Now, what I want you to do is look at, the 4 identity statuses from James Marcia. You'll see identity diffusion, identity foreclosure, identity for moratorium. So look at those. There's 4 of them. because you may see them on your next exam. So make sure you look at them. Now, the fourth one that I didn't mention, and I should mention, is identity diffusion. So, anyway, so moving on. Postmodern critique. The identity status model has recently come under increased criticism as narrow and outdated. The postmodern identity is composed of diverse elements that do not always form a unified self. So postmodern identity changes across contexts and changes continuously throughout the life course. Now, culture and identity issues. Conception of the self is distinctly Western. So more studies are needed on identity development in non-Western cultures. Psychosocial moratorium is more possible in some cultures than in others. So there is limitation on explorations in love and work are tighter for the girls in traditional cultures than for the boys. Only in recent history has the idea of questioning expectations and actively exploring alternatives become prevalent in Western cultures. Globalization is impacting identity formation processes for young people around the world. Again, globalization is opening a lot of doors for individuals from traditional cultures because of what they're seeing, say, in the United States. The rights of women in the United States versus women in other countries. Yes, not 100%. The United States is there where it needs to be, but it's much more than it is in other cultures. Ethnic identity. Identity exploration is often limited in traditional cultures, especially for the girls. So here you'll see in your text different examples of this in these traditional cultures. Ethnic identity. One aspect of ideology is beliefs about what it means to be a member of an ethnic minority within a society dominated by the majority culture. Jean Feeney. Members of minority groups, this is a theory, members of minority groups have 4 different ways of responding to their awareness of their ethnicity. Assimilation, marginality, separation, and biculturalism. Now, going back to identity and globalization, young people around the world now develop what's called a bicultural identity, retaining a local identity alongside a global identity. You see that a lot in the United States with people that come from other countries, move here with their parents, when they have a lot more exposure to the majority culture. There's also something called the hybrid identity, where there's an increase in identity confusion for young people in traditional cultures, because they are trying to bring all of that together. So again, there can be some confusion. So there is an increase in the pervasiveness of identity confusion or marginalized identities. Now, the self, alone. Being alone can be constructive. Time for reflection. There are 2 types here. There's social loneliness, when people feel they lack sufficient social contacts and relationships. And emotional loneliness, when people feel they lack sufficient closeness and intimacy. The self is key here. Excuse me. The self is key here. And yes, having time for self-reflection is good. But if all your time is in self-reflection, you can cause issues mentally. There could be an increase in depression because of being alone. So it's key in our society, and most societies, socialization is key, and being with others also helps to identify the self, because you base a lot of yourself on outward things, not just inward things. So having a lot of friends or a lot of family that you have good, close relationships can be key with self-esteem and self-image. Just like having no friends, having nobody to have contact with can cause issues with depression, anxiety, and feelings of loneliness. Okay, well, that was chapter 6, guys. Look out for next lecture for chapter 7. And if you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to email me or call me or send me messages on Canvas. Okay, thank you so much, and I will see you guys in the next chapter.